You're alive.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a special meeting of the Finance Committee. It is September 22nd. It is 5:16. And we have the review of the fiscal year 2024, the audit, and we have Stephanie Kemba joining us. And we also have Councillor Dean, Chair Fournier. Councillor Beck is with us, and so is Councillor Kemba.
Yeah, thank you. So the fiscal year 2024 audit is complete. We have our auditors here, if you could come to the table. We have Marcus Pratt and Jen Connors. You have a presentation for us.
Yes. We'll get screen here in a moment.
Okay.
Is that your first slide?
Yes.
Sure.
Yes, perfect.
Mhm.
Okay, thanks for having us. As Stephanie said, we're here to talk about the 2024 audit. So I believe you all have copies of this presentation. There's also one up on the screen. It's a brief overview of basically what happened.
The agenda packet.
Yes.
Okay, you have it.
Okay. So we'll go through the presentation and then we probably will discuss a little bit some of the findings that we had, especially the compliance findings and some of the internal control findings that we had. As usual, if anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to jump in at any point. I'm gonna go ahead and go right to the second slide. So this slide kind of talks a little bit about some of the things that weighed down the audit. I know last year we had a slide that was similar to this that talked about some of the issues that we ran into. GASB 96 and GASB 87 are two accounting pronouncements that the Government Accounting Standards Board has issued. They came out not this year, but the prior years. But complying with them has been an ongoing issue. The city does have a lot of agreements. Under GASB 96, the subscription-based information technology arrangements, the city is required to identify basically agreement for software. They're typically cloud-based agreements. And under those requirements, the city is required to record basically an asset and a liability if they have an ongoing agreement to pay for that subscription. As you can imagine, the technology ranges various departments. You have them at the airport, you have them at the crop insurance center, you have them in the school department. So it's a major undertaking to identify all of those agreements. GASB 87 is another one, which has to do with leases, which in the past, those agreements would have typically been treated as operating leases and you would have just recognized rent. But under these new agreements, you now have to again record an asset and a liability. The spreadsheet for the airport alone are 2 Excel workbooks with multiple tabs. So those two areas tend to add a lot of work to the audit. And the second graph that we have here has a little bit of a timeline. And you'll see even after we get the draft of the financial statements, there's a lot of back and forth, and a lot of that has to do with questions that we have about these agreements.
Can I ask a question? So those were all provided last year and again this year. Is there carryover from year to year with the agreements? So it kind of helps you some of it, or?
Typically with the software agreements, you'll see that they last 2 or 3 years and then.
Okay.
So they're constantly rotating.
All right. Yep.
And the city is constantly signing new leases. I know at the airport, a lot of the leases were renewed. So it's an ongoing, it's not just a one and done, we implemented it and we don't.
The other thing I'd add to that too is, being a relatively new standard. Given city staff and us have done the best we can at trying to recognize or record all of those. We're finding in subsequent years, hey, we were unaware of this one. What about this? And some of those agreements, especially like the 87 agreement that predate some of the staff around, go back many years trying to find that original agreement, which is what we're going to base the calculation on, can be a very time consuming process.
Great, thank you.
The second point I had, that you basically touched on is, some of the issues from the fiscal year 2023 audit tended to, flow over into the 2024 audit, and that the finance staff, the treasury staff, still were not caught up on the backlog of work that they had, including the, bank reconciliations. They were behind on those, as well as some reconciliations for some of the other accounts. And of course, this was compounded by turnover by the deputy finance director. So that did tend to slow some things down. In addition, we also tested 10 federal programs for compliance purposes, and a lot of those did have current deadline dates. That's another issue that tends to compound from year to year. In 2023, we had a lot of findings, and if a program has findings in the prior year, then we automatically test it again. So it just is a continued addition of work to the audit. Yes.
On the reconciliation, so you said they're behind on it. How exactly did that hold up the other? Do you have to wait for them to then catch up on all of those reconciliations before you can audit?
Yes.
Okay, just out of curiosity, how far behind were they at the time?
Do you remember?
January of 2025 is when they finally completed the June 2024 bank reconciliation.
Okay.
So some of the areas we are able to do ahead of time, but they can change. And some of that is what adds some of the additional time. And if we audit something and then it changes, we're spending time going back and adjusting our prior document.
Are the ARPA funds part of this audit, or is that completely separate?
Part of it. So yeah, it's identified as its own fund. In addition to that, the spending is considered federal. So I believe it is one of the programs that tested for federal compliance during 2021.
Whose responsibility is it for the reconciliation? Is it one person, or do different departments have different people that work on it?
Typically in the past, it's been the payroll and accounting specialist. We had lost the person in that position back in the end of fiscal year 2024. So essentially, when I arrived as the assistant finance director, I was working on those. Now it's a combination of myself and the payroll and accounting specialist right now, because she's still in training. Currently, we're up to January, February, getting the activity posted and reconning them. But she's still in training, so I'm trying to put a template together so that we can just fly through them once the template's made up, which I'm almost finished doing.
Thank you.
If you want to go to the next slide. This is another slide that we had in last year's presentation, and it ought to be included again, because it kind of gives you an idea of the timeline of how things went. We do typically start the audit at the same time. The financial statements themselves did go out a little bit earlier. In 2023, they were dated July 22nd, and in 2024, they were dated June 30th. So not a great improvement, but some improvement. So as I mentioned, we had our audit start the week of October 21st. Then we've had some follow-up in between. We did come back for an additional 3 days in December to do some additional work. And then after that, it was a series of back and forth. We did get the first draft of the financial statements on March 5th. Then we had additional questions. We got a revised copy of the financial statements April 18th. And then we sent back final review comments May. And then the technical review happened in June. So that kind of gives you a rough idea. The compliance report was dual dated. And what that means is that most of the programs, we did finish testing them when the financial statements went out. However, we did have one last program that we needed to wrap up, and we had a lot of back and forth. And because of that, we couldn't officially date the testing for that grant until August, when we finally wrapped that up. The next couple of slides, we have our summary of the audit results itself. So the financial statements did receive an unmodified opinion, which is a clean opinion on the financial statements. Besides that, we do have a report on internal controls over financial reporting, which is required under government auditing standards. And under those standards, we are required to test internal controls that they relate to financial reporting. So we come in and test some of your big areas like cash receipts, cash disbursement, payroll disbursements, all of those areas. We did not have any findings. However, we did have a material weakness related to the cash account reconciliations, and that was a repeat finding. And again, it's because constantly trying to catch up, those reconciliations are done so late. It can be a material weakness in that you may not necessarily detect errors or other things that may be going on with those cash accounts. We did also have a significant deficiency. And just so you know, a material weakness would be the highest level of an internal control comment, which under those circumstances, a material weakness is something that is basically systemic. It's something that you really should be concerned about. A significant deficiency would be a step down from that, where it's significant enough that we bring it to your attention, but it's not necessarily something that's systemic. We did have a comment for material audit adjustments, since we did have a lot of adjustments, as well as financial statement preparation. And then under the audit, we also issued a report on federal compliance.
Quick question, on those material and significant deficiency, those are they both just a time issue, not a process issue? I mean, is there anything that needs to be changed with control or how things are done? It's just a matter of getting them done sooner?
Well, the material weakness it's kind of a combination. It's the timing of the reconciliations as well as the significance of cash itself. Because it is the most prone to error and that.
So the pause weren't giving, I'd heard from people a lot after they pay their tax bill. It never bothered me, but they'd call 30 days, they'd see them a month later, they said, hey, my check for my taxes isn't cleared. So cash was sitting, checks were sitting in the office, not being deposited. I mean, this is still, I know it's still going on. The last, what are we in September? Probably in March, I think that was still going on in the spring as well. I don't know how we're doing with it this month because tax bills were just paid. So hopefully they're doing better now. But it's funny, it does actually bother people when the checks don't clear right off.
Right. That was part of the issue. The significant deficiency, the audit adjustments, a lot of that did have to do with timing because the staff was behind on their work. They really didn't have the time to do a thorough review of all of the accounts that relate to the audit itself. So sometimes we would find things and then they would have to go back and adjust it for them. The other report that we issued had to do with federal compliance, and because the city does receive and spend over $750,000 in federal grants, it is required to undergo what's called a single audit. And under those requirements, which the guidance is actually called uniform guidance, we are required to come in and test the city's major federal programs. The city does actually have a significant amount of federal expenditure. It's just shy of $30 million. If you look at the schedule of expenditures of federal awards, that spans actually 3 pages. So it's a significant amount of grants that the city does receive and so for that reason, there are a lot of programs that we have under those requirements. We did put in a list of all of the grants that we tested. Women, infants, and children, also known as WIC, which is the Department of Health and Community Services. Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which is also known as SNAP, which is also through Health and Community Services. PDG, which is through Community Development, the ARPA grant that you mentioned earlier. Federal Transit Cluster, which is the bus program. The Federal Highway Administration, which is the FACT program. Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services program projects, which is also Health and Community Services, as well as the tobacco and the opioid and the block grants for substance abuse. Those are also through Health and Community Services. Under the federal compliance testing, there were no material weaknesses, but we did have some compliance findings, and we also had a few significant deficiencies. So out of the programs, we tested 10 for federal purposes. 7 of those programs actually had compliance findings. And then the other 3 received unmodified opinions, which means they had no compliance findings, but they did have some other comments. And then if you go to the next page. We are also required to do some testing under Maine Uniform Accounting and Auditing Practices for community agencies, also known as MAP. And that is the state's version of the uniform guidance. So under MAP, we are also required to test state grants, or they're either originate with the state or they're passed through state agency. We are required to test grants that are over 100,000. So a lot of the programs that we test for federal purposes also have to be tested for MAP. And that again includes WIC, opioid SDR, the SNAP program, public health nursing, and then the DOT transit related projects, which was part of the bus program. Under the MAP guidance, there were no material weaknesses, but we did have significant deficiencies and compliance findings. And then we'll go over some of those findings a little more in detail, but I'm going to switch over and Marcus is actually going to go through some of the financial information.
Good, thanks. Yeah, as Jim said, the name of the slides here go over some of the financial information that is contained in your financial statements. Have some comparative information for prior years and to some other communities as well. This first slide we have is summarizing your general fund balance, broken up into the 5 different categories that are required for GAAP. You have your non-spendable fund, which is funds that are not typically in a spendable format. Prepaid items and inventory are really the big items that you typically see in this. You guys also have some advances to other funds that fall in this category as well. You're restricted, which is amounts that are for TED capital support and the school department balances. Restricted is typically amounts that are restricted by an outside party. So that could be like a debt covenant, grant, that sort of thing that are externally restricted. Committed, on the other hand, is typically internally restricted at the highest level of decision-making authority. So that would be the board. So if you guys put money aside for a reserve, that would end up being committed. So that amount for 2025 is your carry forwards for the various departmental expenditures. They carried from the 24 budget into 25 budget. Your assigned fund balance includes amounts that are set aside for encumbrances, workers' comp, and various reserves. If you guys budgeted to use fund balance in your budgetary process, that would also be included in this category. So it's not quite as restricted as the restricted or committed categories, but does still separate it out for an intended purpose. Your unassigned fund balance is everything else. So it's the amount that is available for use for any specific purpose. In total, your fund balance increased by just over $1 million between FY 23 and FY 24. Looking at this graph as a whole, you can see a pretty good upward trend to your fund balance, where you have a fair bit more in 24 than you did in 2020. I think we all know what happened in 2020 to get you that nice big jump, but you guys still have trended positively in fund balance in the last 5 years. We'll go to the next slide. The next few slides here are going to go over your budget results. So we'll have your budgetary amounts. You actually fared, actually result of that, and then some variance. The first one goes over your revenues. It is city and school. We'll have expenditures after this, and then we'll have specific slide on school expenditures by the 11 categories. So, yes.
Do we know why the variance is so large under other intergovernmental school?
I believe that also includes your grant funds, because of the way you guys do your budgetary process, it includes all those school grants. So like ESSER, for instance, if you guys spend $2 million more than you're budgeting for, it blows that category out of the water. So I believe that is the reason for that. I don't know specifically what grants it was, but I believe that's the reason. Yeah. So tax revenue, you're a little bit higher than budget due to increase in vehicle registrations. So you're had an extra 624,000, 70 million that you guys budgeted. State revenue sharing exceeded budget as state revenue exceeded expectations. This number is kind of a shot in the dark to a certain extent. It really depends on what actually happens. But overall, you guys were pretty close on your estimate. Other intergovernmental for the city was under budget by about $1 million. And this is due to lower than anticipated amounts for homestead and FEMA reimbursements. I believe there is also a portion of that is related to why is it escaping me? You mentioned on the next slide. General assistance. You have a little bit lower general assistance than as well. I believe that's partly due to some other available programs in the area. Pulling away from that program. Other intergovernmental school revenue, $11 million over budget. As I mentioned, this is due to receipt of prior year grant allocation and amounts that just were not budgeted under this grant program. Licenses and permits, you're about $325,000 over budget. This was due to increase in demand for building permits. What happened during the year? Your charges for services were almost $700,000 over budget. This is due to an increase in firefighter outside duty and demand for rec programs, and then all the way to global fees had a good increase as well. Other financing sources were higher than budget due to improved interest rates. That's primarily on interest. I get included in that one. We'll go to the next slide. Thank you. As I mentioned, this next slide is over your expenditures for general fund. General government expenditures were lower than budget by about $1 million due to unfilled vacancies in public transportation drivers and turnover in the city clerk's office. This is an explanation I'm taking on all of my clients. Very hard to hire people right now. Looks good on paper. Unfortunately, there is other impacts to that, and I'm sure you guys are well aware of that offset the monetary gain, essentially. Public safety was under budget due to open positions. Health and community services and recreation expenditures lower than budget due to lower, as I mentioned, lower demand for general assistance. And that is due to other programs that are available in the area that cover roughly the same benefits. Public services, you're about $700,000 under budget. This is due to lower than anticipated de-icing fuel and open positions in several departments. Education expenditures, you can see, were $4 million under budget. We'll talk about those in the next draft in more detail by the 11 state articles that are required to be approved. And then education other, again, this is the grant stuff at 17 million additional in revenue and 9 million additional in expenditures, as most of those grants typically offset with revenues and expenditures being equal. So overall, we were 1.6 million over budget. Budget balances. However, there is that. You can go to the next one.
I'd like to add that Councilor Mallon has.
Trying to reach down before I have to fix.
So this slide, is the last one over your budget to actual. And this goes over the school department expenditures specifically. So that number we saw on the previous slide for regular school was broken down into the 11 articles that the state requires pass in the state education coding structure. It gives you a little more detail on kind of where that money is spent. Your regular instruction is the only category where you are over budget. This is due to a late entry that was identified during the audit process that was not covered by the 5% transfers. As I imagine you guys are aware, the state allows the schools to transfer up to 5% between budget categories. Transferring out more than 5%, that's allowable by state law. Special education was lower than budget due to multiple open positions on the trend. And out of district placement needed was about $1.1 million in savings, quote-unquote savings in that category. Student and staff support was just under $200,000 under budget, and this was included 6 years of a curriculum review, however, only one was purchased. So you anticipated buying the entire suite of the system, but only paid for one portion of it this year. Debt service was about $700,000 under budget, as the school anticipated a bond issuance during the fiscal year. That did not occur, so had less debt service. And then it is important to note that transfers out on slide 6 also includes the school department expenditures. This is a area that a lot of my clients are very keen on the last couple of years at the very least. And it is your general fund unassigned fund balance as a percentage of prior year budget. You guys are relatively consistent throughout the 5-year graph that we show. You do have a formal fund balance policy that targets between 1 and 2 months of operating expenditures, which calculates out to 8.33 to 16.66% of those expenditures. That is with excluding debt service from that calculation. Per the city's policy in 2024, the unassigned fund balance is 12.43, which is squarely inside that policy. From 2020 to 2024, unassigned fund balance as a percentage has decreased by about 1.4%. Again, overall, relatively consistent. You have a couple of years that are a little on the higher side than the rest of the graph, but across the 5 years, pretty good with the policy. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. And then this graph, we compare that same number to several other communities that you guys typically use as kind of a basis point for how you stand versus the rest of the communities in the state. One important thing to note is you will see that both Auburn and Augusta do show 0% for 2024, but that is only because at the time of completing the presentation, those cities have not finalized their 2024 audit, so those numbers are not available yet. In addition to that, all of the calculations include city and town and the school department's respective budget. So if one of the other towns includes school department as a separate fund on their financial statements, we have included that information in calculating it, that we were comparing apple to apple. From a quantitative standpoint, you guys are relatively comparable to other cities in the state. Portland is kind of the outlier. I honestly say that about everything. That Portland is kind of an animal of its own in the state. They're really just so much larger than everyone else, and they tend to be a lot more complicated. So it doesn't always tend to be a one-to-one in that comparison. But the rest of the communities that are listed, you guys are pretty consistent with. Certainly not loads underneath, loads less of a percentage than they are. By far not the lowest on the list, for sure. We can go to the next slide. This slide really doesn't have a ton to talk about, to be honest. It's your collection of your current year tax revenue. So how much of your commitment did you collect in the current year? And every client I've seen is in the high 90s. 97, 96 is the lowest you see on this chart. Excuse me. Now, when you're talking the magnitude of the dollars that you guys have for a tax commitment, a change in 1% can mean a lot of money, for sure. But you guys do still tend to hit that 90+% collection rate, and that is all as of the end of the fiscal year. So a lot of the prior collections, so if you look at like 2023's or 2022's collections at 6/30/24, you end up being higher than what is listed on this graph, because this is just within the fiscal year. So for you guys, you were at 98.25% in 22 and 97.7. So small amount lower than in 22, which really could just be general fluctuations. Everyone's feeling the impacts of the current economy. So that could cause a slight reduction in what you're receiving. Next slide. Another comparison that is typically appreciated with my town client is debt per capita for you guys compared to some of the other community. Again, Portland, you can see, is quite the outlier in here. They have a fair bit more debt per capita than you guys did. This could be for a few different factors. This could be how things are structured. The important thing to note with this slide is it is only taxpayer funded debt. So for you guys, the perfect example is the arena bond that you guys issued 15 years ago, something like that, is not included in this calculation because the taxpayers are not footing the bill for that directly. The revenues that you're receiving in that fund are paying for that debt service. So if Portland had a similar bond that was funded through taxpayer debt, then it would skew this calculation just a little bit. So as much as you try to be apples to apples, in a sense, some of that's just not possible. And then it's important to note, previously you might be saying, hey, where's Auburn? We have them on other slides. They no longer report that per capita in the financial statement. So while we could probably get close to the number, it might not be exact as we would have reported in prior years. We have excluded it. And that is the presentation we have. We do have the findings and many of their material we can go over. You guys would like to discuss those?
The one I did find, when you did that last slide, is debt per capita more important or debt as a percentage of your actual budget? I mean,
I don't know that either
we have
one.
a city with very high like commercial value, and they have a lot of debt. They might not have a big population, so it wouldn't be as big.
I don't think either of them are necessarily more important than each other. I think they both have important, they both have their place. Because as you said, you might have a higher revenue base and a lower population. That means your debt per capita is really high, but it's not really that difficult to pay off.
The other question was, you did the presentation on the school side of the budget. When you come in and your team comes in to do the audit, do you get the school information directly through them, or do you work with the finance department and they work with the school department? How's that process work to do the audit?
A little bit of both, but most of the information we get directly from the school. I mean, the school and the city work hand in hand throughout the year regardless because how intertwined they are. But, you know, we'll get stuff directly from the school that, you know, we're not necessarily getting from the city, but the city's obviously getting.
But they had the timeliness issues that you see. I mean,
So yeah, I mean, it's a little hard because the school doesn't have their own cash account. They're included in the cash account of the city. So we can't really have.
they don't have to reconcile.
To a certain extent, I think that has changed over the last couple of years where there's a portion that is the school's reconciliation now, but it is a chunk of the larger reconciliation. So if the school's able to get their stuff done, the city kind of still needs to do their reconciliation because it's always possible that the school did it and there's an error in the reconciliation that wouldn't be identified until you kind of put it all together. So I will say, I do think they're feeling the effects that the city is just the same as of turnover, not having enough staff to do the thing that everyone wants to do. But it unfortunately isn't a same comparison.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just going back to the beginning here, with the GASB 96 and 87. And the reconciliations that are done. I'm trying to wrap my head around what's slowing down getting a completed audit. Or is it a bunch of little things that's adding up that slows that process down? I don't know if it's the reconciliation because it's been so delayed, or if it's the GASB 96 and 87. That's slowing
Yeah,
down.
all of the above, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's just a lot of little things.
So if you could focus on, if there was one thing that the city could be doing to help get this done a little bit faster, what do you think that would be?
So I think it sounds easy and right.
I know.
Easier said than done.
I know, I get that, and I'm not trying to point fingers.
For sure.
I'm not-
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A big thing is having everything ready when we start and when we have time to schedule. Because if we're trying to audit areas in January, when our schedule's kind of already segregated to other things, you know, we have other clients outside of you guys, obviously, I don't think that's a surprise. So when we kind of change over to other times of the year, it makes it more difficult to kind of come back to it. Now, January is kind of a bad example. January is not as hard to get back to. But I'm trying to get the stuff in April. It gets a lot more difficult because we're trying to prepare for the 2025 season. And then we kind of get conflicting interests because if we completely ignore the 25 audit, in this case, 25 is going to be a lot worse. So we kind of try to get as much of both done as possible. And yeah, I think that would be the big thing, is what I would say. Jen wants to add anything else to that, but I think that's pretty much it.
No, I think that very much covers it.
When you're doing the cash recons, it's a lot easier to do a cash recon when you're doing it at the end of a month for the previous month. But when you're trying to go back 8 or 9 months and you don't recognize transactions, you know, like a lot more research is involved. So, especially if you're not familiar, because if it just happened last month, you're like, oh, okay, I know what that is. But it makes it, the further back you have to go, the harder it is.
If the delay in the audit has only been significant the last 2 or 3 years, so am I right? So is the scheduling new because of short staff? Because this seems to be, I understand what you're saying about the scheduling and maybe we not having work ready when you're ready and then trying to come back. But it seems like it's something new in the last couple of years. It seemed before the last couple of years. So what was working before the past 2 years that's new, that's not working as well now?
So it's kind of a compounding effect. Part of it is a tired excuse, but COVID had a lot of implications for things. Not only the turnover that you guys have had, you know, for the longest time, you guys had Deb as the finance director was here for a significant significant amount of time, and then Dave, who had also been here for quite a bit of time. When you get turnover in those positions, you know, when Deb took the city manager position, that's a lot of knowledge that was lost in that position. So I think from even that side of things of city staff preparing things, it takes a little longer because you're not necessarily as familiar with it. That mixed with, you know, we'd love to have more people at our work too. So some of that, you know, we definitely feel effects of that, you know, turnover in staff. We're not having as much experience as we'd necessarily like in the positions that we have, or in some positions, I should say. So all of that kind of compounding over time has made it the last couple of years is what's been more noticeable, if that makes sense.
I was just gonna say, I feel great that we've got an unmodified opinion. It just makes me feel really good, so.
It should, for sure. That's, I mean, that's what we're.
I mean, that's great, thank you.
So, if you guys wanna, you can go over the comments. So we've already touched a little bit on the material weakness. Read through the detail if you guys like, but the gist of it is the June bank reconciliation wasn't completed until January of 2025, which is kind of the crux of the issue. On the reconciliations is a key to having accurate information. In essentially the 6 months that it took to complete bank reconciliation, who knows what could have happened. We don't necessarily think anything did, but it's, you know, the risk is increased with the longer it takes for that reconciliation to be completed. Do you want to add anything? Sound like yeah.
No, I just, I was just gonna say that we have a meeting scheduled for them to give us suggestions on what kind of processes we can put in place to try to eliminate or at least improve the situation moving forward.
Right. So we are working together to try and get things done in a more timely manner. Yeah. And you know, that's always the goal. It's my goal to have all of my jobs done by the end of the calendar year. How practical that ends up being for all of them is a client by client basis. That's where I start my season at very least. So the other kind of bigger comment on the internal control side of things that we had was the significant deficiency over material audit adjustments in financial statement preparation. So this is, you guys do prepare your own financial statements. That has not changed from prior years. The financial statement side of things is kind of a result of the audit adjustments. The big thing here is we feel that the more things we have to change as we go through the process, the higher the risk is. So the ideal method is we get something, we look at it, we go, that looks good to me, and we kind of move about our day. If we have to change a number from, you know, 2 million to $500,000, there's a lot of wiggle room in that amount. Now, our opinions always include a degree of uncertainty, because there's always something that could be unidentified that we're unaware of, and that is technically a misstatement. You know, we don't have to worry about every single misstatement. You know, if it's $10, I'm not really going to worry about it. It's the nice thing about being on the audit side of things. But the more things that we change, the higher that risk gets. So, yeah, so due to the short staff, finance department had less time to review year balances and reconciling to some of the 20 documentation required. Or and then 96 stuff, we do our own procedures to identify things that are potentially missed. And you go, hey, what about the lease that you have with company X? And it takes time to find the schedule, and we ultimately decide, okay, they lease under 87. It might only be $1,000 a month, but that ends up being a calculation of $2 million because it's scheduled out for 30 years or whatever.
Okay.
The next comments we have to do with the compliance findings for the federal programs themselves. So we did have a finding for allowable costs for time and effort documentation. And this really relates to all of the grants that we tested under the Health and Community Services Department. We found, we did some testing of the payroll documentation, and what we determined is that people were being charged to these grants based on the amount that was budgeted at the time. So if they had a certain amount of payroll that was budgeted to, say, the tobacco control program, then they would segment that and charge that amount to the grant. Whereas under uniform guidance, you are supposed to base personnel charges on actual time worked. If you do charge personnel services to grants based on a budget, or some kind of other amount, at the end of the grant, you do have to have some kind of show up so that the end result is what you are charging to the grant is what was actually worked. We obviously had to give a compliance finding because we couldn't verify for sure the amount of time that was actually worked on each of these individual grants. And the department is working on putting in place a process to actually charge actual time for each of those grants. Want to do my CVB?
Sure. Yeah, so ultimately, this finding we had, actually, this one is just a significant deficiency. This is not a finding. So when we do our compliance testing, one of the things we look for is that the costs of the grant are allowable and applicable costs for that grant. One of the things we identified in the CDBG program is that city staff that were not associated directly with the CDBG program were coding and charging expenditures to that grant without the knowledge of the director. The amount that we identified, even after we extrapolated the difference, was not material to the grant. So why it's not a compliance finding, we didn't find material non-compliant. But because there was expenditures that was charged to the grant without the knowledge of the grant administrator, we consider it a significant deficiency or a control deficiency, where ideally the director of the program should know about all of the charges. And ideally it should only be the director of the program charging amounts to that grant. I do believe at this time there's been discussions internally and that's the case moving forward. So as a corrected, thankfully it is a relatively easy correction to make. Now all the activity flows through these. This one is a compliance finding and this is a significant deficiency. One of the newer, definitely newer, at very least an overlooked area of reporting requirements in the past is FATA, what people are calling it. It's the Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency. Essentially, when you have subrecipients under a program, there's special reporting that you are required to do. That include whatever information that you're supposed to include, information about the subrecipient, the contract, all of that sort of thing. The CDBG has determined that some of the programs that they have do have subrecipients, and that reporting did not happen during this fiscal year. Part of this, I think, is the director being trying to figure out what that reporting looks like and how to do that reporting. From my understanding, it is a question kind of that's been posed to a lot of recipients of CDBG money. How is that supposed to look? What are we supposed to be reporting? Kind of thing. So for 2024, that had not happened. I know that they're working on being in line with that. Is one of the things that I don't know how
Yeah, they gave a very comprehensive
Yeah.
management response. It's about paid long.
So I believe one of the other portions of this as well, as there's a lot of reports that are required under CDBG, 6 different reports, I think, so it sounds about right. Somewhere in that ballpark. We also identified that there's some reports that either were unable to be identified as they were filed in a timely manner or were not filed. And I understand why that's kind of an unfortunate area for compliance finding, because if it's due 10-1 and you submitted it 10-2, it ends up being compliant finding because there's no real threshold for how late was it. So even the day ends up being a finding. Sure, it was. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So this one is not a compliance finding, so it's just a significant deficiency. And this is more of a process-related breakdown. So part of the BACS program is you're required to have a local contribution, usually between 10 and 20%. The way the city has historically funded that local contribution is doing a transfer when you accept the program. So if you accept a grant for $100,000 with a 20% contribution, the council approves it and staff does a transfer to that fund to add the local money. This year, you guys had a couple of grants that had several adjustments between the original and the final agreement. There were many amendments to that. Some of those amendments did not get the additional funding placed into those, or the additional transfer put into that fund. It was not a significant amount. It was an immaterial amount, and why it is not a compliant finding. But that breakdown in process very easily could have been a material amount. If you got $1 million agreement, that would have been significant very quickly. Thankfully, it was not. So that is not the case. And I believe the breakdown in this was well, city staff do attend the meetings. There's not necessarily always a connection between going to the meeting and so making that connection between the approval and city staff doing the transfer is what Dave was working on, improving the process. I don't know if that's in the works still, or if that's.
It is in the
all
works.
set.
We're looking at the minutes and we're actually watching videos to see what's been approved and.
That amount, is that something that just washes away, or do we have to make that up because of the deficiency?
So there's nothing to really make up in this. The grants themselves are on a reimbursement basis. So this is another one of those areas where I kind of hate giving comments like this, because you spend $1 million, then you bill the feds for your 80%, and they'll give you the $800,000. The process you guys have chosen to recognize your local contribution is on the front end, though. A lot of my clients use the reimbursement process as their match because they only draw 80%. So I don't think in any of these cases you got more money than you were supposed to. So the practical impact here is more that fund in your accounting system might show a deficit because you didn't contribute enough to it. Eventually that would become very obvious because it would sit there until it was taken care of. But that the process in which you have for a control was not working the way it was intended, which is the reason for the comment.
We'll talk about the next couple of findings. They both have to do with the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, which are also known as the ARPA funds. The third finding we specifically had to do with the school department. The school department was also a recipient of ARPA funds, which they did use for playground equipment and a leased modular. Because those expenditures were significant enough, they triggered procurement standards under federal procurement requirements. So under those requirements, the school department is supposed to follow procurement procedures as well as they are supposed to meet the requirements for suspension and debarment. So for suspension and debarment, they are supposed to verify that that candidate is suspended or debarred and that they can actually do business. They do also have to document that, which in this case, they didn't actually document that they had verified that the vendor was not suspended or debarred. Also, the school department did rely on its historical knowledge and experience with the vendors, so they did not actually follow the procurement procedure. So that was a finding. The second one, was actually on the city side, and, it had to do with reporting requirements for ARPA, which, because the city is a second tier community, they are required to submit project and expenditure reports on a quarterly basis. And those reports are supposed to include all of your expenditures under ARPA. We did identify, one expenditure, that was supposed to be included in an earlier report than when it was actually reported. So, when the review was done of the expenditures and the report was prepared, that expenditure was missed. So that was a compliance finding because the expenditure was significant enough that it should have been included. I don't remember the dollar amount off the top of my head,
But it was reported previous.
it was reported after, reported that it should have been included.
Okay,
So it was.
it's a timing issue.
Yes, yep, it was reported, it should have been included on the quarterly report ending September 30th. But it was not reported until the quarter ending December 31st. Let's see. The next finding that we had had to do with the Health and Community Services grants. Specifically for the opioid SDR and the block grants for prevention and treatment of substance abuse. And the substance abuse and mental health services. A lot of words that go into those grant names. And this had to do with reporting. So the grant agreements do have certain deadlines for monthly reports and when they are supposed to be submitted. It is 15 days after that month's end. And the Health and Community Services Department had 4 monthly reports that were not submitted by that 15-day deadline. So that was a finding. And then the next one also had to do with Health and Community Services. Some of the same grants we just mentioned. And this had to do with subrecipient reporting and, well, actually had to do with subrecipient monitoring. Some of these grants do have sub-awards where the department enters an agreement with other organizations, passes through the money, and then it relies on those organizations to provide reports on how they spent that money. What we did find is that they were relying on just information that was reported by those organizations and they weren't actually verifying the information. So they weren't getting additional documentation to verify that they had actually spent the money before they got reimbursement. They weren't doing additional procedures to make sure that those amounts were up for allowable costs. So that triggered some of the requirements such as monitoring cash management and monitoring allowable costs, excuse me. So we did make a recommendation that they implement some policies and procedures specific to monitoring, so that they start beefing up some of that documentation for those. The last one, yes, the last one. The last comment we had was not a compliance finding, but it was a significant deficiency. This had to do with the Federal Transit Cluster, within that's the bus program. And under this, we obtained the reimbursement request that the bus director prepares each year. And we usually review those to make sure that the amounts that are included in the reimbursement requests are allowable under the grant. We did find that some of the amounts that were included in the calculation of the expenditures were encumbrances, which the city is not allowed to be reimbursed until they actually spend that money. Whereas an encumbrance is more about recognizing that they will spend money but they haven't spent it. Although we found that there were some costs like property and liability insurance that were included in the calculation that had not gone through the federal procurement standard. The reason that it's a significant deficiency and not a compliance finding is because the bus director had not actually submitted the reimbursement, she had not actually drawn down the funds yet. So when we pointed out the amount that had not been included, he did adjust the reimbursement request and remove those amounts. And she is going to be working on a template so that going forward, those amounts are not included in the reimbursement requests. And that is it for the comments. Does anyone have any questions about any of those?
Were any of those recurring? And those efficiencies that finding came up? And if that compared to that same question, part of that process, do you ask management what the correct action is for each one of those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they have a corrective action plan included with each of them, or at very least a response. I believe the only ones that are technically corrective action, we label it both corrective action and management response. So yeah, all of them have a response to that.
Yeah, the compliance report is required to be submitted to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, and they are required to provide a corrective action plan. All of the federal agencies that pass through federal money require a corrective action plan. And the question for what is UCP, I know the material was just for the tax reconciliation for the VP.
It looks like only one of the repeats, which is the R1 on filing monthly reports in a timely manner.
Right, part of the compliance report actually in the back is there is a section that has to do with prior year findings. So if you go to that, you will see the RVP. Or it will say if it was corrected.
Pretty close to the end of the
Yes. Yeah. So that would be the financial statements. This is in the compliance report, which is a separate report.
Yep. I'm sorry, I did not put them on the iPad, but I will send it to you.
Any other questions? Comments? Thank you for your presentation. And do you have anything else for us, Stephanie?
I don't. I really appreciate you guys sending.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I guess we will adjourn our meeting at 6:19.